Today's lecture will be on the lower respiratory system. When we're looking at the lower respiratory system, we're going to be talking mainly about the bronchial tree. So when we're referring to the bronchial tree, we can see how the trachea comes down and it's going to bifurcate or split. This split is going to be the beginnings of what we consider to be the bronchial tree. So when we're looking at the main bronchi as it comes down from the trachea, we look at some general characteristics. So when we're looking at the right main bronchi and the left main bronchi, these bronchi have more complex rings of cartilage. This area is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which also has the goblet cells for mucus production, and also has a complete cartilaginous or complete ring of smooth muscle, which is found in between each one. So we have both the cartilage and the smooth muscle component in the right main bronchi and the left main bronchi. When we're looking at the main bronchi, we go into smaller segments, the right lobar, so right here, here, and here. These are also called the secondary bronchi. In the right-hand side, we have 3 lobars or secondary bronchi, and then the left side, we have 2. These are correlated with the lobes. So if I draw lines over here, we can see that the right side has 3 lobes and the left side has 2 lobes. And the reason why we only have 2 lobes on the left-hand side is because this is the cardiac notch. We just have to make room for the heart. So as we go into the segmental branches, you're going to notice some changes. We see that the cartilaginous rings are going to become smaller. When the cartilaginous rings become smaller, we also see changes in these segmental branches. On the histology aspect, they're only lined with ciliated columnar epithelium. They still produce the mucins that can be coughed out through sputum eventually. These are going to continue to go into smaller segments. So as we're coming down, we're going into smaller bronchi. These are eventually going to be going into what we can call bronchioles. And a bronchioles has no cartilage. It also has a thicker, so as we keep going down, we're just eventually going to make our way into the alveoli. So again, we have no cartilage, there's a thicker layer of smooth muscle, and this is important for the smooth muscle to be able to bronchoconstrict or narrow, or bronchodilate, which means relax or to allow more air. This basically regulates the amount of air traveling through the bronchial tree. So for bronchoconstricting, then we're not allowing air to travel all the way down into the alveoli. Eventually, this is going to come into a terminal bronchiole, and the terminal bronchi or bronchiole is what we consider to be the alveolar or the respiratory portion. So when we're looking at the respiratory portion, we're looking at the terminal bronchi. Here, what we're going to see as we're traveling down, we see the bronchioli, we see the lack of cartilage, we see the ability for vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And then as we're coming down, we're eventually going to come into what's called a respiratory bronchi, or bronchiole, and this has just a simple epithelial tissue, which is much thinner for gas exchange. These respiratory bronchiole are going to change into alveolar ducts, so we'll see air traveling down through into the alveolar ducts, and then these alveolar ducts again are simple squamous epithelial for rapid diffusion, and then eventually we're going to terminate into the alveoli or the alveoli sac. So in the human lung, we have anywhere between 300 and 400 million alveoli. So we have a lot of surface area for gas exchange. This thin wall helps promote gas diffusion between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. Also, what we have are a series of alveolar pores. So these alveolar pores provide collateral ventilation between each and every alveoli. They also contain an interalveolar septum and elastic fibers. And these elastic fibers are important. It gives the ability of the lung or the alveoli to stretch during inhalation and recoil during exhalation. As mentioned previously, we can see here we have a branch of the pulmonary vein, which is bringing oxygenated blood that surrounds into the capillary bed of the alveoli, where we'll see gas exchange. Carbon dioxide will be offloaded and eventually going back through the pulmonary artery and then going back into the heart into general circulation. So when we look at first, what we're going to be looking at is basically the inner surface of an alveoli. Here you can see we have erythrocyte or a red blood cell. We can also see that we have a pulmonary capillary. And we're going to have certain structures that are going to help protect the lung and help for the rapid diffusion. The first structure that we'll talk about is this one here, the alveolar type 1 cell. It's a simple squamous epithelial. It just helps promote rapid diffusion. We can see over on this side, the rapid diffusion. We see the erythrocyte coming in, or the red blood cell. We see the diffusion of oxygen being picked up by the red blood cell, and the red blood cell is offloading CO2. Eventually, this is going to go through the diffusion of CO2, is going to be expired out of the lung. Another important characteristic is the alveolar type 2 cell. This secretes a pulmonary surfactant. It's composed, the surfactant, or what it makes is composed of lipids and proteins. It helps coat the inner surface of the alveoli. This helps reduce surface tension. So when we see the inhalation and exhalation occurring, so it helps just reduce any surface tension that may occur during the expansion of the lung. Also, what we see is the alveolar macrophages here. So with the alveolar macrophages, they can either be fixed. So this one that I'm pointing to here, this one is fixed. It remains in the connective tissue of the alveolar wall, or it can be free. And this free helps engulf microorganisms or particulate matter. These free macrophages, they can leave the lung through the lymphatic system, or they can be eventually coughed up or expelled during exhalation. So this next slide is going to show a little bit of the pathway of the lymphatic system as it relates to the lungs. So the first thing that we see is deep inside. Here we see a node, here we see a node. This is going to be the pulmonary lymph node. The lymph nodes are important because they collect any carbon, dust, pollutants that were not filtered out by the upper respiratory system or the lower respiratory system that was lined with the pseudostratified ciliated epithelial cells. So anything that was not trapped and expelled will eventually come into the alveoli. Through the capillary exchange, we'll see the lymph, the interstitial fluid will be picked up, changed into lymph as it enters into the lymphatic vessel, and eventually the afferent vessel will come into the lymph node. And from here, we're just going to follow a pathway as it comes through. So it goes into the pulmonary lymph node, it's going to exit through an efferent lymphatic vessel, and eventually it's going to make its way up to the next portion, which is going to be the bronchopulmonary lymph node. Again, afferent will be coming in, bringing the lymph with any of the pollutants that were trapped. If it's necessary, we could have an immune system response, so we could trap the pathogen or the antigen inside of the bronchopulmonary lymph node, and the lymphocytes could take care of that pathogen. From here, we're just going to travel up a little bit higher, and it's going to go into a secondary or a third portion of a lymph node called a tracheobronchial lymph node. Same thing, anything coming in is going to be afferent, and as it leaves, it's going to be efferent. So we have a series of checks. We have 3 lymph nodes that are going to be trying to trap any pathogen or antigen before eventually we drop the lymph back into general circulation. The next one we see is going to be the largest. It's going to be the bronchiomediastinal trunks. These bronchiomediastinal trunks here on the right side and here on the left side. And they're each going to drop back into the cardiovascular system in different areas. So on the left side, we see the bronchomediastinal trunk is eventually going to go into the thoracic duct, and on the right side, the bronchomediastinal trunk will eventually drop into the right lymphatic duct. So we just have the ability for the left and the right lung. They're eventually going to terminate either in the thoracic duct on the left side, or they're going to terminate on the right lymphatic duct on the right side. So with the skeletal muscle aspect, we know that the muscles of quiet breathing are primarily through the diaphragm. So the ability for inhalation occurs with the diaphragm and the external intercostals. We know that the diaphragm is being innervated by the phrenic nerve. And quiet breathing, we see that as you inhale, the diaphragm and external intercostal will allow for inhalation or oxygen to come into the lower respiratory system. And on exhalation, it's just a pressure difference. So once the lung goes into a high pressure system versus the atmospheric pressure, we'll see exhalation. But with exhalation, we don't see any muscle contraction. We only see muscles used in exhalation when we consider it to be forced exhalation. Usually forced exhalation or forced inhalation is usually triggered by the brainstem during exercise, or it can be triggered by the limbic system through different types of anxiety or things like that. So with forced inhalation, we see the sternocleidomastoid, we see components of the scalene. Most of the breathing is going to occur in the anterior portion. So in the anterior portion, we see the sternocleidomastoid, the scalenes, and the pec minor. But we do have stabilization muscles that occur in the posterior. So inhalation can make changes in the posterior compartment and the serratus posterior superior, and a little bit with the erector spinae. During forced exhalation, it's the same thing. 4 of the 5 muscles are going to be on the anterior compartment. So during forced exhalation, we have the transverse thoracocist. We see the internal intercostal, external obliques, and the transverse abdominis. So a lot of the forced exhalation is going to be coming from the abdominal cavity. During forced exhalation, we also see holding on to the posterior compartment is going to be the serratus posterior inferior. But during quiet breathing, we should be activating our diaphragm with these 2 muscles, but we should not be using a lot of, so for instance, like mouth breathing, you'd be at rest, you'd be kind of using a forced inhalation type of patterning. So when we look at the changes, the way it should occur is the first thing that should occur is that we see changes in a vertical plane. So if your diaphragm is utilized correctly, the phrenic nerve will innervate the diaphragm and we will see the contraction. So we'll see the diaphragm flatten out, and which then pulls on the inferior portion of the lung, which causes a vertical change. After that, what we see is changes in the lateral. So ribs 12 and 11, we should see changes of increasing the thoracic cavity on the lateral. So we should then see the second part is going to be changes that occur in the lateral. And finally, we would see changes in the anterior and posterior. Most of the changes are going to occur in step 3. Most of the changes are going to occur in the anterior position, but the serratus posterior is also going to make changes a little bit in the posterior compartment. So when we start talking about the innervation of the breathing centers, a couple of things that we should point out first is what is considered to be the respiratory centers. So normal inhalation should be about a 2-second inhalation with a 3-second exhalation. And we find the 2 centers that make up the respiratory centers. The pontine respiratory center, I'll refer to it as the pneumotaxic area, which is located in the pons. And then the medullary respiratory center, which is composed of the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. These two, the pneumotaxic area in the pons and the ventral and the medullary respiratory centers, are what we consider to be the respiratory centers. Some of the main parts that the pons does, this pneumotaxic area basically allows for smooth transition from inhalation to exhalation. So you can see that when we draw a line, the pons that transition between inhalation and exhalation, everything is going to be centered around the dorsal respiratory group. So all the input that we're going to point out in this is going to eventually go into the dorsal respiratory group. When we continue to explore the dorsal respiratory group, some of the things that can trigger the medulla is going to be an irritant receptor. So irritant receptor is usually located in the nasal cavity, again, is going to terminate at the dorsal respiratory group. This can trigger the medulla to stimulate the medulla to cough, to sneeze. When we look at the baroreceptors, we see baroreceptors in the heart, lungs, blood vessels. This also is going to go to the dorsal respiratory group, and it's basically monitoring any pressure changes that are occurring in the heart, lungs, or the blood vessels. When you start exercising, in particular, we're going to look at the proprioceptors, say for instance like the muscle spindle. Again, this is all going to lead into the dorsal respiratory group. So any type of concentric contraction that starts to begin, say with exercise, is then all going to go into the dorsal respiratory group. We also see over here, we also see chemoreceptors. So chemoreceptors are important because they're going to measure pH in the blood, or they're going to be watching pH in the blood, CO2 concentrations in the blood, and also oxygen concentrations in the blood. So we have the vagus nerve, which is the main chemoreceptor that's located on the aortic bodies, which is going to go into the dorsal respiratory group. We also have on the common carotid arteries, the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is also going to go into the dorsal respiratory group. So the dorsal respiratory group's job is to take all this information and eventually relay it into what is considered to be the ventral respiratory group. So I'll just erase this. So we have all these inputs coming into the dorsal respiratory group here. We also have input, the pons is going to now input that smooth transition into inhalation to exhalation. But everything from the irritant receptor to the proprioceptor to the chemoreceptors are all coming into the dorsal respiratory group. It is going to communicate. All this information is going to be sent into the ventral respiratory group. The ventral respiratory group's job is to initiate neural impulses for inhalation and exhalation. So once all the input is given into the dorsal respiratory group, all the information is collected into the ventral respiratory group. Once that occurs, then we can see, based off of the input from the dorsal respiratory group, the ventral respiratory group can make changes to breathing. So in the medulla and the ventral respiratory group, we'll follow the first pathway. It could trigger the phrenic nerve, and the phrenic nerve will then activate the diaphragm. During exercise, say for instance the proprioceptor with contraction, you begin to exercise, that information goes to the dorsal respiratory group, which then triggers the ventral respiratory group, which then is going to trigger the connection to the spinal cord, which is then going to connect into the intercostal nerves. These intercostal nerves will then allow for activation of forced exhalation, such as the internal intercostal. So this is just a general pathway of how your brainstem. Oh, the last part I should mention too is the cerebral cortex. I'll draw a line here, such as your limbic system and the cerebral cortex. It also can trigger any accessory muscles of respiration. So for instance, with forced inhalation, muscles such as the sternocleidomastoid here, the scalenes, the erector spinae, any accessory muscles that are used for forced exhalation also can be triggered. So the cerebral cortex has a direct link that bypasses the medulla during breathing. So this was just a short lecture on the lower respiratory system.